The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the most ancient, perhaps the most ancient stories on the planet. It's a tale that begins with friendship and heroism, but then takes us to the frontiers of the known world, and eventually to the boundaries of life and death themselves. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In the Classics of World Literature series, I give a brief introduction to texts from all over the world that have stood the test of time and that speak to us across cultures, oceans and centuries. This is the first episode in the Classics of World Literature series, and I can't think of any better place to start than with one of the oldest stories we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe to the channel, and I hope you enjoy the episode. The Epic of Gilgamesh begins with the line, "He who saw the deep, saw what was secret, discovered what was hidden. He brought back a tale of before the deluge." It's a dramatic opening, one that promises a story of secrets and of hidden depths, and it's into those depths we're going to go in this episode. And what I hope to do is give you not only an introduction to the Epic of Gilgamesh, but I hope a sense of how to approach this very ancient and in many ways very strange story. So what I will do is in this first section, I'm going to give some of the historical context of when and where Gilgamesh was first told and written down, and also some ideas about how do we approach myth. We have a story that's clearly not realistic, not intended to be realistic, that seems very alien to us in some ways. So what do we do with this? In the second part, I'm going to try to think through a little bit the ideologies and values of the story. Of course, stories can tell us much about what people in a particular time or a particular culture think about the world. How should a particular location be ruled? How should people act? You know, all of these quite basic questions, and we can get a sense of it through the Epic of Gilgamesh. Then in the third section, I'm going to talk about the relationship between Gilgamesh and other stories and myths. We see echoes of Gilgamesh elsewhere. And in fact, if you may have picked up on one already in that first short quotation I just gave you, what I'll do is I'll go through a bit more systematically and thoroughly where we see elements of Gilgamesh reappearing, popping up at different times and in different places. So I hope you enjoy this journey with me, and I want to begin just by thinking about and emphasizing just how ancient this story is. So I'm recording this in the year 2024. If we think about literature, you know, if I just say the word literature, I think nowadays often you maybe think of going into a bookshop and the majority of the literature there is, right, shelves of novels. In fact, nowadays, do we go to a physical bookshop very often? Maybe not. If we do, half of it might be, I don't know, self-help books on how to be a millionaire or something, but the literary bit is probably going to be predominantly novels. But really, this only became the dominant form quite recently. You know, we get the rise of the novel in the 1700s, you know, Jane Austen writing right at the end of the 1700s into the 1800s, and then, of course, the 1800s, you get Dickens's and Tolstoy's and Balzac's and, you know, all those great realist writers. So the novel is really a pretty recent form. Before that, we have drama and poetry, you know, thinking specifically English literature. You know, if you go and do a degree in English literature, Beowulf is one of the earliest texts you're going to look at. You can't read it because it's not anything like modern English. And it's a story about Scandinavia, but that's kind of where we begin. That's in the 700s. We go back to one of the foundational texts of, well, I suppose Western culture, Christian culture, of course, is the Bible. The New Testament was written following the life of Christ up to around 150 CE, Common Era. The Old Testament was written earlier from around 400 BCE onwards. So, now we're getting old. We're, 2,400 years in the past. If we go to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh was king of Uruk, a real place, around 2,800 BCE. So we're going further back from zero in the standard calendar than we are on from it now in the year 2024. And the first Gilgamesh poems started to appear around 2200 BCE. And you get various versions of it. So around 1700 BCE, you get what's known as the Old Babylonian Epic. Around 1200 BCE, you get the so-called Standard Babylonian Epic, or He Who Saw the Deep. And this is the version I just read from. This is the version I'll be referring to in the episodes that come, for the simple reason it's the most complete version that we have. And I'll talk about completeness in just a moment, okay? So, not only is this a very old story, but it's one that was told over a long period. From the first poems to He Who Saw the Deep, it's being told and retold over a period of 1,000 years, which indicates it was probably very, very important culturally to those cultures in that region. Despite all the changes and rises and falls of kingdoms going on, this story somehow is persisting. And there is different versions. And I think this is something that's very interesting about old stories. We're in the realm of orality rather than written text. And of course, when something is spoken, it's much more malleable, we could say. A particular storyteller will probably adapt the story to his audience. He might make local references or even jokes that are going to be relevant to the people who are listening. And depending on the occasion, it might be lighter or heavier. Depending on young people listening, is it adults, men or women? Okay, so there's huge scope for a storyteller to adapt his story to the audience when it's being spoken orally. And of course, these may be just in the moment, they may be kind of done off the cuff, but those particular variations may evolve, and we may get, the story branching off into kind of new traditions, if you like. So I think Gilgamesh, we need to think of it not so much as a single story, but as a tradition, wherein there are, of course, variations around a core tale that does remain recognizable. Now, I've just talked about orality, but of course it was written down, otherwise we wouldn't have it. And it was written in cuneiform, a very old form of writing that was developed from pictograms into a writing system with these horizontal and vertical strokes. And that writing system emerged from 3000 BCE onwards. And the region we're talking about and where cuneiform writing emerged was Sumer, which is in southern Mesopotamia, the region that's now Iraq. And Sumer, the Sumerian civilization, was possibly the world's first, or certainly one of the world's first civilizations where we get writing, where we get, settlements, cities, and the things that go with these. So, He Who Saw the Deep is the standard Babylonian version of the story. And while Gilgamesh is a tradition and we don't know who told or even wrote down many versions of the story, we do have a name for the author, or maybe better consider him an editor of this version, a guy called Sinlik Unini. And this version was written in the Akkadian language, which is related to Hebrew and Arabic. It was collected from various manuscripts that were found in the cities of Nineveh Babylon and Uruk, these great evocative names of that region and of that period of antiquity. Now, many of the tablets were lost and were found again in the 1850s, and they're now in the British Museum, which gives us some indication as to who found them. And of course, any material is potentially, can be destroyed or damaged. And this is the case with these stone tablets. So, many of them were partly destroyed or partly damaged. And A.R. George, who's the editor of the Penguin edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh, in his introduction, advises us to approach what lies ahead as a book part eaten by termites, or a scroll half consumed by fire. So I think this is actually one of the fascinating things. It can be a frustration, but it's also a fascination that we have these gaps in it. And the editors of a text like the Epic of Gilgamesh had quite a job. Even just think of translation. When you're translating to or from a modern language, you have many other sources to sort of check and corroborate against. But when we're going so far back, the text we're dealing with is one of the only sources. There isn't something else necessarily that you can check it against. And then sections of it are missing. So, you get, again, in the written version, for example, the Penguin version I've just mentioned, you get these ellipses, ... where something is just missing, maybe whole sections missing, sections where the editors have had to take an educated guess, in some cases quite a firm guess, in some cases a bit more conjecture. And again, this is part, I think, of the interest of studying something like He Who Saw Deep. So it's a poem, an epic poem. It's about 3,000 lines in total, written down on 12 tablets, but the 12th is not really part of the story proper. It's the translation of an earlier poem describing Gilgamesh going into the netherworld or the underworld. And of those 3,000, about 575 are completely missing, others partially missing. So there are big gaps in it. And what I'm going to do now is, a big spoiler alert, I'm going to give you a summary of the whole story. And I guess I'm doing so because it's not like a new novel or Netflix series where we're maybe on the edge of our seat waiting to see what happens. This story has been around a while, so it is known. I know maybe people listening don't know it, but I think in order to elaborate on the kind of approaches to these very ancient stories that I'm going to talk about, I think need to give the story. If you would like to skip these spoilers, feel free to do so for the next couple of minutes. So Gilgamesh, our protagonist, is the semi-divine king of Uruk. And I think this is very common in ancient stories, that the boundary between the divine and the mortal is very, very blurred. Think of the Greek myths where you have the gods having offspring from mortal women, usually. Zeus gets around, let's say. So you have, these family trees of the gods and humans kind of mixing with each other. He's a semi-divine king of Uruk, and he's a cruel ruler. His people are unhappy, so they appeal to the gods for help. The gods respond by sending a man called Enkidu to tame Gilgamesh. Now, Enkidu himself is a wild man. As he approaches the city of Uruk, he's first kind of associating running free with the wild animals, but is then himself tamed by, sometimes translated as a prostitute, courtesan, let's say, is sent from Uruk to tame him, and she does. And as I go through this summary, I invite you to, again, just notice similarities with other ancient stories and myths, or echoes of other stuff, or I should say, because Gilgamesh comes first, other stuff has echoes of Gilgamesh. Now, Enkidu and Gilgamesh eventually meet, and of course they fight in two sort of, don't like the term alpha male, but I guess it's, we have two strong, dominant men here. They meet, they fight to a standstill. Neither can get the upper hand over the other, and then they sort of say, okay, let's be friends, and they are. And from this point on, they have a number of adventures together. They go out from Uruk and they have their adventures together. These include going and killing the demon Humbaba, fighting and killing the bull of heaven. And I'll elaborate a little bit on some of those a bit later. As they do, the people of Uruk become much happier during this period. They become great heroes, they're celebrated, and then Enkidu dies of an illness sent by the gods. Gilgamesh is heartbroken, and he kind of wonders what to do. He can't accept this. So he hears of a man called Utnapishtim, who's been given by the gods the secret of eternal life. So Gilgamesh goes on a quest to find Utnapishtim. Goes on a long journey, does indeed find him, but Utnapishtim refuses to give him eternal life. But there's a kind of second chance because Utnapishtim's wife tells Gilgamesh about a plant that can restore youth. And Gilgamesh, in fact, finds this, but then it's then stolen away by a snake. Sound familiar, or familiar with something else? And then Gilgamesh eventually returns to Uruk empty-handed. Okay, so I'll go into some of these sections in a bit more detail shortly. Okay, but I think before I do that, I think it's useful to think of, okay, this story is mythical, it's heroic, these characters are larger than life, they're semi-divine, but clearly it's not realistic. I mentioned some of these events and characters. Who or what is the bull of heaven? Okay, what's this plant that can restore youth? Who's this Utnapishtim, right? So how do we approach myth? Well, I'm going to give you a number of approaches, and again, I invite you to sort of think through how these could be applied to the Epic of Gilgamesh. So one approach is historicist. So the idea here is that myth is an account, but obviously somehow distorted, of actual events that took place, and we can think of why this distortion might happen. And usually it's because narrative is not disinterested, it's not neutral. Often artists, writers, storytellers would be, telling the story perhaps to the king or to at least the king's people. So of course somebody has to look heroic. The people in the audience need their particular culture to look heroic. So that's part of the reason why this distortion happens. Another approach is we can think of myth as a nature allegory, a way of explaining how and why natural phenomena take place, in particular things like natural disasters. A storm or a flood happens, many people die perhaps. Why did it happen? Well, of course, the gods were angry, all right? We could think of more regular phenomena as well. The sun and the moon are often personified in divine figures, behavior of animals, for example, okay? All of these things, we've got nature allegory as an explanation. Now, these are very old. Coming more modern, we could think of psychology, okay? Psychological approaches give us a new angle. We could think in Freudian terms, Freud's idea of the unconscious as part of this mind that's functioning in a way we don't fully understand. So, for Freud, myths reflect our fears, our taboos, our desires that we can't openly express. So, of course, one of his famous examples is the Oedipus myth. Oedipus unknowingly killing his father and marrying his mother. So Freud taking this and saying, this is something we can't say that out loud. Or we could go to Jungian psychology as well. Jung is more interested in what he calls the collective unconscious, how the unconscious functions almost on a psychological level. And he has this idea of archetypes, that particular characters represent sort of recognizable characters that we ourselves can embody, or that embody particular types of people within a culture. So, the wise old man, the young warrior, the trickster. Another approach is that what could be called charter myths, that myths are used to justify the existing structure of power. So this could be linked, I guess, to historicist approaches as well. But basically, the myth justifies why the king is the king, for example, or why people on a lower level are down where they are. And a final approach is connected to ritual and religion. So the idea is that myths grew out of rituals, and maybe the origins of those rituals get lost, but then a narrative or a story attached to them kind of justifies and explains them. So just to summarize, we have historicism, we have nature allegory, we have psychology, whether Freudian, the individual unconscious, or Jungian, who's interested in the collective unconscious. We have charter myth, which justifies and explains power structures, and we have myth, which gives a narrative around rituals. And I think, already maybe you can see how I've just given you the outline of the Epic of Gilgamesh, how some of those might be related to these ideas, how some of the elements of the story, we have the protagonist as a king, okay? So perhaps this myth is justifying the fact that Uruk was a king, or later celebrating it because maybe it's his descendants who are still rulers, okay? These battles between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and then the fights they have with other people, are these actually accounts of real battles that have been distorted and sort of given mythical status to explain, and again, maybe to justify them, to make them sound heroic, okay? I talked about Gilgamesh being a wild man before he reaches Uruk. Is this something to do with, the relationship between humans and nature, particularly given that Uruk was one of these very, very early cities? There's something here about, maybe moving away from nature and becoming more of an urban culture, okay? So I think certainly we can see the potential for some of these explanations, and I will finish this first section now. What we'll do in the second part is actually I'll go through some of the episodes I've just described, and we'll look at perhaps some of these explanations in a bit more detail. So see you for part 2 shortly.